On September 7th, 1812, right outside of Moscow, two of the largest armies ever put on a battlefield faced off. What happened next would go down as the single bloodiest day of the entire Napoleonic Wars. This is the story of the Battle of Borodino. I mean, just try to wrap your head around the sheer scale of this. We're talking about nearly 250,000 soldiers from all across Europe, all converging on this one spot. They were locked in this colossal fight that was going to decide the fate of Moscow and maybe Napoleon's entire empire. And the human cost? It was just staggering. In about 12 hours of fighting, the combined casualties hit around 75,000. Think about that. That's an average of over 100 men falling every single minute. The battle even earned a grim nickname, the Battle of the Generals. Yeah, the fighting was so intense and so up close that nearly 80 French and Russian generals were either killed or wounded. This tells you that the leaders weren't just directing from the rear. They were right there in the heart of the slaughter. So how did it come to this? How did two of the greatest armies in history, led by these legendary commanders, end up in this single horrific day of butchery? Well, to really get it, we have to look at Napoleon's invasion of Russia. Up to this point, he'd seemed pretty much unstoppable. His Grande Armée had just plunged deep into Russian territory. At first, the Russian commander, a guy named Barclay de Tolly, was smart. He refused to give Napoleon the big, decisive battle that Napoleon desperately wanted. Instead, he used this classic delaying operation. He just kept retreating eastward, trading space for time, stretching Napoleon's supply lines until they were paper thin, and basically letting the brutal Russian landscape do his dirty work for him. And you know what? This strategy was brutally effective. When Napoleon started his invasion, he had a massive 3-to-1 advantage in numbers. But by the time he got to Borodino, starvation, disease, and exhaustion had just hammered his army. The forces were now nearly equal. The odds had completely changed before a single major shot was even fired. But here's the thing. You can't retreat forever. Russian morale was in the tank. The Tsar was facing huge political pressure, so he swapped out Barclay for the old veteran Mikhail Kutuzov. Now, Kutuzov knew the retreating strategy was working, but he also knew that for the honor of Russia and to stop his own army from just falling apart, he had to turn around and fight.
So let's head to the battlefield itself, because this is where it gets really interesting. Before the fighting even started, both commanders made some huge mistakes that basically guaranteed this was going to be an absolute bloodbath.
Kutuzov picked his spot at Borodino, and he anchored his defensive line with 2 major fortifications. On his left, he had these 3 arrow-shaped mounds of earth called the Bogrotin Flaches, and in the center, this huge fortress-like thing called the Raevsky Redoubt. These 2 spots, they would become the epicenter of the whole battle. But look at how he set up his troops. This right here was Kutuzov's great blunder. He put his best army and most of his powerful artillery on his right flank, a position that was already defended by a river and was pretty much impossible to attack anyway. This left his much weaker, much more exposed left flank dangerously vulnerable. Napoleon saw this weakness immediately. His best marshal, Devout, practically begged him to let him take a huge force and just sweep around that weak Russian left flank. It was the classic Napoleonic move, but for some reason, Napoleon, completely out of character, said no. He chose a direct, brutal, head-on frontal assault, straight into the Russian guns. And that decision set the stage for some of the most ferocious, desperate fighting of the entire war, all centered on a couple of mounds of dirt. The whole thing really unfolded in 3 main, chaotic acts that kind of bled into one another. First, you had the relentless French assault on the Bagration Fleche. Then, out of nowhere, a surprise cavalry raid bought the Russians critical time. And it all ended with this final climactic showdown for the big Raevsky Redoubt. So the battle kicks off with a massive French artillery barrage, followed by waves of infantry charging the Bagration Fleches. The fighting here was just savage. We're talking about furious, close-quarters combat with bayonets and clubbed muskets. Those Fleches were taken and lost and retaken 7 different times. The real turning point in this part of the field came when the Russian commander of that flank, the super charismatic Prince Bagration, got hit by shrapnel from a cannonball. As he was carried, dying, off the field, the morale of his soldiers just collapsed. The whole Russian defense on that side started to crumble. Now, Just as Napoleon was getting ready to deliver the final blow to that weakened Russian line, something happened that nobody saw coming. Way up on the northern edge of the battlefield, about 8,000 Russian cavalry found a way across the river and came crashing into the French rear. They slammed into supply wagons, support troops. It caused total panic and confusion. Now, militarily, the raid didn't do a whole lot of damage, but its timing was everything. It forced Napoleon to halt his main attack for 2 critical hours while he sorted out this new threat. That delay gave the Russians just enough time to regroup and reinforce their shattered lines. It's a perfect illustration of Napoleon's own famous saying, "Ground I may recover, time never." Okay, once that cavalry raid was dealt with, Napoleon focused all his remaining fury on the last big objective, the Raevsky Redoubt. He launched this massive, all-out assault, throwing everything he had, infantry, cavalry, and a huge concentration of cannons, at that one fortified point. General Barclay de Tolly, the guy who was in command before Kutuzov, literally called it a walk into hell as he watched his men march into that storm of French cannon fire. The redoubt was eventually taken, but the cost for both sides was just horrifying. The battle had essentially burned itself out. So by the end of the day, the French held the field, but it was a victory in name only. And one decision Napoleon made has been argued about by historians ever since. All through the day, his marshals were begging him, pleading with him, to commit his last fresh reserve, the elite 18,500-strong Imperial Guard, to land that final knockout punch. But Napoleon, so far from home, refused. He wouldn't risk his last ace in the hole, and that decision allowed the Russian army to escape, to retreat and survive. So let's look at the final scoreboard, so to speak. Did the French win? Well, they held the territory, but they completely failed in their main goal, which was to destroy the Russian army. The Russians retreated, beaten up for sure, but still a functioning army. Napoleon hadn't won a decisive victory. He'd just captured a field of corpses. And that really brings us to the final big question. Napoleon went on to capture Moscow, only to find it burned and empty. The victory at Borodino cost his army thousands of irreplaceable veteran soldiers that he couldn't afford to lose. It led directly to that disastrous winter retreat that completely destroyed his Grande Armée. So yeah, the French won the battle, but was Borodino the very place where they actually lost the war?